Hello, everyone. My name is Carly Jensen, and I'm a fellow with the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College. Today, I am joined by Dr. Jennifer Murray, who is an expert and professor on American military history at Oklahoma State University, and she also specializes in the Civil War. She also used to work as an interpretive park ranger at Gettysburg National Military Park for 9 summers, so she is well-versed in the power of place and the movements of the battle. She is leading 2 walking tours at this year's Civil War Institute Summer Conference, exploring the role of the 11th Corps on Cemetery Hill and the Union First Corps on July 1st, which you will not want to miss. The Civil War Institute Summer Conference is June 9th to 14th, and registration is open now, so you don't want to miss this. Thank you again so much, Dr. Murray, for meeting with me. I'm super excited to jump into some great conversation with you.
Thank you for having me, Carly. I'm looking forward to chatting about my CWI programs with you and our audience.
Yes, it's going to be great. First of all, lots of historians like to focus on specific regimental histories. At this year's summer conference, you'll be leading 2 tours, like I mentioned, on the Union 11th Corps and one on the 1st Corps. What drew you to the stories of these regiments in particular?
So I've been part of the Civil War Institute, I believe, since 2010. I think this is like my 14th year as being a faculty member at CWI. And as you mentioned, I worked for the National Park Service as an undergraduate, then through my MA and through my PhD program. So I know the Battle of Gettysburg very well. It's the best 72 hours of history that I know. And I always like to do something different. Over the summers I've been at CWI, I've done a variety of either regimental, like follow the footstep programs that sometimes is on the CWI conference, Union regiments or Confederate regiments. But this year seems to be an opportunity to focus more at a corps level. And I've picked 2 federal corps that we'll be looking at on the different days. You mentioned the one program on the 11th Corps, which is one of the evening programs. I think will be out from about 5:30 to 8:30 or so, which will be exciting because that will roughly parallel the time that the 11th Corps is fighting on July the 2nd on Cemetery Hill. And I picked that one because I think of probably of all the days, and this is true for the 1st Corps program too, of the 3-day battle, it's like the first day of the battle gets overshadowed. And no doubt some of the attendees or people listening to this are familiar with Killer Angels, or we all have seen the movie Gettysburg. And the first day is just so truncated in that narrative. And we focus on the 2nd day with the iconic fighting at like Little Round Top and Devil's Den. Then, of course, Pickett's Charge is the big moment on July the 3rd. So it often struck me like the first day is just overshadowed in a lot of the Gettysburg story. And it's an opportunity to understand the battle. The first day sets up the entire battle, and taken alone, it's one of the top 10 bloodiest days in the American Civil War. It's an interesting battle to look at on July the 1st. And we'll see that really with the 1st Corps and how the battle develops. So I guess I would say that that's kind of a long-winded explanation to say that I've always been interested in July the 1st. It actually might be my favorite day of the battle. And this is an opportunity to talk about 2 corps in the Army of the Potomac that plays such an important role. The 1st Corps on July the 1st, and then we'll talk about the 11th Corps a little bit on the 1st, and then certainly following their story on July the 2nd.
Awesome. You're so right. The first day does really get overshadowed by these romanticized battles on the 2nd and 3rd day. And so it's really important to really go back to the start of everything, because you're right, we wouldn't have the 2nd and 3rd day battles without the 1st. So that will be really interesting to hear more about.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, I mean, the first day is important because neither Army commander is there to direct the battle. Robert E. Lee doesn't come until 2:00 in the afternoon on July the 1st, and George Meade, who is my biographical study right now, doesn't show up to Gettysburg until after midnight on July the 2nd. So it's a day's battle where decisions are made by subordinate commanders that have a tremendous amount of influence, not only for July 1st, but how the second and the third day play out as well.
Yes, definitely. And I'm really excited to hear more about that because it's hard to imagine what it must have been like for those soldiers to have to take command before their commanding officers got there.
Yeah.
The Union First Corps is often celebrated for its bravery and sacrifice, both at Gettysburg and elsewhere. The 11th Corps, not so much. How does your interpretation of the 11th Corps and First Corps actions contribute to that larger conversation about battle performance and historical memory?
Oh, that's a great question. So let's maybe start with the 11th Corps first, and I'll answer that one first. No doubt a lot of people coming to Civil War Institute are familiar with the 11th Corps and their reputation coming into the Gettysburg campaign. It's a corps that is unfortunately positioned at Chancellorsville and suffers a pretty stunning setback or reversal as they get hit by the Confederate attack at the Battle of Chancellorsville. And they get all sorts of unflattering nicknames as a result of how quickly their line broke at Chancellorsville, from the Flying Dutchman to cowards. This is a corps that's comprised of ethnic units, certainly German immigrants. So that makes them a popular target for scapegoating. And they carry that reputation, this corps commanded by Major General Oliver Howard, onto the fields of Gettysburg. And no doubt the 11th Corps has the unfortunate position on July the 1st to be actually probably right where you're at now, almost in the fields of Gettysburg College, north of town. They're out around Barlow's Knoll. They're in these open plains, and they are going to be hit on July the 1st by a Confederate assault. They will end up falling back through the streets of Gettysburg through the evening of July the 1st and rallying on Cemetery Hill that evening. So it's a corps that, again, at a quick glance, seems to be maybe not really yet proving their mettle or willing to fight or hold their position. And that story continues through the night of July the 1st. And then on July the 2nd, they're taking up a position at Cemetery Hill, and they will be attacked by Confederates in the afternoon and the evening of July the 2nd. And there, and this is kind of the title of my talk actually for CWI, it's like their redemption story, where the 11th Corps will fight on July the 2nd, and they will be able to hold Cemetery Hill against the attack from the Confederates. Perhaps the most important part of the Union battle line is Cemetery Hill, and by 8:30 or 9 o'clock, their position is secured, and they have redeemed themselves through all the turmoil that they had on the 1st and that they brought with them from Chancellorsville. So I guess that's sort of a pitch to say that hopefully taking the tours out for CWI and walking the grounds, we have 3 hours to do this tour in June on the fighting on July the 1st. And then we'll start out near the Gettysburg College at Barlow's Knoll. We'll hop on the bus and go over and do the stuff on East Cemetery Hill on July the 2nd, walking the ground and putting soldiers' accounts with the terrain and being able to see the position that the 11th Corps held. I'm hopeful will give the CWI attendees maybe a more nuanced story of what the 11th Corps faced at Gettysburg and the way in which they were able to redeem themselves at that battle.
Yes, that's super exciting because it's really hard when you have these memories that have just in these things that have just stuck with a unit for years. How do we combat those and show that they are more than just their failures and they really do have their redemption here at Gettysburg? That's really interesting. Speaking of being on the ground of the battles, how does the power of place affect your interpretation, and why is it so important that we block these historic landscapes in order to fully more understand the First Corps and 11th Corps' actions on July 1st and the Battle of Gettysburg as a whole?
Yeah, that's a good question too, and there's no substitute for the battlefield landscape. It's our greatest primary tool. It's our greatest primary resource. So being able to take the accounts of the soldiers from the Iron Brigade, for instance, and go out in McPherson's woods and talk about their fighting there on the morning of July the 1st is priceless. where we can look at the terrain and stand where the 6th Wisconsin stood. We can go up to the railroad cut where Rufus Dawes was on the morning of July the 1st, a 24-year-old. He's about to turn 24, to stand on that ground and understand the terrain, see what they saw as close as we can 160 years ago is absolutely invaluable. And I'm of course a big proponent of getting out on the battlefield and taking my students out on the battlefield landscapes and walking this ground. It's the best way to understand the Civil War or really any historical event. We can read all the soldiers' letters we want. We can read all the books that historians write, but there's no substitute for being out on the ground and walking it yourself. You understand the battle and the adversity and the courage and the heroism of these Union and Confederate soldiers so much better when you're out on the field.
I agree 100%. There's no substitute for breathing the same air these soldiers breathe, feeling the same sort of breeze. And being that the summer conference is in June, you're so close to the July 1st through 3rd date. So you'll really get to kind of experience the same sort of weather these soldiers might have experienced. So it's really, really awesome to be able to go out on the battlefield and see for yourself. Because you're right, there's no substitution for actually seeing the terrain.
Yeah, that's always my favorite part of CWI, right? Like leading the tours and being out on the battlefield is always the highlight of my conference. And I know that many of the attendees feel similarly too.
Definitely. I'm very excited to see more about that. And finally, what work do you think needs to be done to continue preserving and telling these soldier stories?
Well, I think we're doing it in part. Certainly, the Civil War Institute is a great opportunity to continue to tell these soldiers' stories. For attendees who come to the Civil War Institute, we get to spend a week talking about the Civil War, about the Battle of Gettysburg, being on the landscape, walking the footsteps of these soldiers, hearing what they experienced, talking about their sacrifice. That's the best kind of work that we can do to continue to preserve their stories, is come together at the Civil War Institute and talk about the men of the Union Army's 1st Corps and the men of the Union Army's 11th Corps, which is what I'll be talking about and what people on my tour will be talking about. So we're doing it. I'm doing it by teaching Civil War class here at Oklahoma State. You're doing it by taking Civil War classes at Gettysburg College. We all have ways that we continue to make sure that the men who gave the last full measure of devotion, that their stories will continue to be heard and resonate with people 160 years later. So I'm glad to have a role at the conference, and I look forward to getting out on the battlefield and taking people on these tours and meeting everybody in June in Gettysburg.
Yes, this is so exciting. This is really one of the only opportunities we have to fully go and meet with all these amazing historians, battlefield interpreters, and just walk the landscape. It's such an incredible opportunity, and you will not want to miss it. Well, thank you again so much, Dr. Murray. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about your work with the 11th and 1st Corps, and thank you again for your time.
You bet. Thanks for having me, Carly, and I look forward to seeing everybody in Gettysburg in June.